Hey, so in listening to you all speak about general irresponsibility of statistics being used or initiatives being used against the Black community, or whether or not the ghetto was caused by external factors or is being exacerbated by Black communities, I was reminded of Heather McDonald coming to speak to the law school a couple weeks ago. And an argument that she employed and that I've frustratingly heard rather often is to use statistics of Black violent crime or other statistics of Black communities to justify initiatives taken against the Black community, or even the increased police shootings against Black people. And I was wondering what you all would use to employ against arguments like that, or against arguments that are kind of justifying things done against Black people because of statistics that are prevalent within the country.
I'll start. I'm sure Khalil, and so much of my thinking on this is kind of comes from Khalil's ideas about the ways in which statistics become this text, these discourses in terms of talking about inequality, criminality, et cetera. But part of it is that the crime, it's really tricky to measure crime, and the crime rate itself is very flawed, most fundamentally by the fact that we don't measure, the crime rate itself is class. We don't even measure white-collar crime. We have no kind of sense of that. So the crime statistics are reflected in what is called street crime, and they're also based largely on arrests. So in many sense, and policymakers recognize this. They recognize this from the beginning of kind of the development of the modern statistical apparatus in the mid-1960s. Part of the investment that Johnson made is kind of creating a whole new computerized criminal justice data system that would allow policymakers and law enforcement officials to better measure crime. But when you're basing crime rates on arrests alone, that's essentially reflecting to some extent police contacts in certain communities. So if you have a targeted deployment of police officers in Roxbury, in Detroit, in low-income Black and Latino communities, there's going to be a higher rate of arrests, and that then shapes the crime rate. On top of that, the crime rate measures, so say a group of Black youth, 10 Black youth are arrested for robbing a liquor store, and they're all found. None of them are even indicted. They spend the night in jail. They're arrested for it, but the charges are all dropped. The arrests of those 10 youth still factor into the crime rate. So again, this is the ways in which, and I mentioned this at the very outset of my remarks, but the assumptions that go into that targeted deployment in the first place, and then the statistics that support that deployment become this self-fulfilling prophecy where the continual kind of flow of law enforcement resources are consistently invested in these over-policed and underprotected low-income urban communities.
I want Tommie to respond to this question.
I can say something to
this. This is really important to what he's doing. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, one thing I think we could talk a lot about to what extent there is a violent crime problem in poor Black communities, and we could talk back and forth about how bad is it and whether we're measuring. I think those are important conversations to have. But I think what we find ourselves doing is trying to deal with a range of forms of disadvantage using crime control measures. So people who are oppressed and are constrained, they're often frustrated and angry. They often lose hope. They often strike out as a result. Sometimes they lack means, and so they participate in unlawful activities in order to try to gain income. But some of those things that they're doing in response to the constrained circumstances that they're under. Now, you could just continue, as I think Khalil raised earlier, you could just say, well, look, we're not going to do anything about that. All we're going to do is just use the various features of the criminal justice, various dimensions of the criminal justice system to just contain, and we're not going to do anything about the things that might encourage unlawful or sometimes even violent conduct amongst some of the most deeply disadvantaged people in society. So what we've done, for the most part, and done this for a long time, is just rely on various features of the criminal justice system to deal with social inequality.
Right.
So I think that's the way, I think it's important to contest the stereotypes about black criminality and about the way in which we count crime, but it's also important to, I think, contest, even where there is violent crime to be dealt with, that the only way to deal with it is with the criminal justice system.
Right.
And quickly to that point, just to extend that point, it's not an abstraction. Two things. One, domestically, when levels of white premature death, when there is violence directed against white people, historically we've seen this happen. It's been read as a symptom of something in the society, of which the response is to fix the society. So you can read more about that in the work I've done. But even internationally, when we measure the health of other societies, we measure the health of other societies by interpersonal violence. And we assign all sorts of categories of health and wellness based on whether we're going to lend to those societies, what are the democratic principles we're going to hold the governments accountable for, if there are levels of violence within those communities. So essentially, only in America, with regard to black people, do we literally throw our hands up and say, oh my gosh, black people are killing themselves. Like, how can we do anything about, let's put more police officers in the community. I mean, that's what we've been doing now for 50 years. And miraculously, the last thing I'll say about this is black people have actually been figuring out on their own how to make their communities safer in spite of the occupation of police forces. One theory about this, I'm rolling it out here for the first time, but inspired by American Divided, you should really watch it. Your minds will. This is why things that tell good stories are helpful to us. They help our imaginations to grow. They feed our thinking and creativity. But what if you treated the vast majority of gun violence in the black community not as criminality, but as evidence of, essentially frontier society, where in frontier societies, most interpersonal violence is treated as self-defense. So if you listen to violence interrupters, if you listen to the people who live in those communities, there's really no hard line between the perpetrator and the offender. And essentially people are like, I have to carry a gun because I never know, where violence is coming from. And in this country, when that was true of white men, most white men, unless they killed someone of a higher class status, another white man, they generally got off because the jury of their peers essentially said, well, hey, I would have shot the guy too if he stepped on my shoes or insulted me at a bar. So we've actually created yet another double standard in this country where we've built a whole pathologizing discourse around black people who, with reason, and this is part of the point that Tommie says, and rationality, are not only afraid because the law essentially has retreated or is untrustworthy, or they're fighting over the spoils of an illicit economy. You can't sue somebody if somebody does you wrong. And then we've said, you're bad people, and we're going to put abusive police officers in that community to either do harm or arrest as many of you as possible.